We've got a full program tonight, so I'm going to start, and hopefully people will still filter in, since the opening remarks are introductory. Don't miss that much. It's only me. Good evening. I'm Bob Michael, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program presented by the New York City Bar Association and sponsored by its Committee on Middle Eastern and North African Affairs. For those of you who are not familiar with the New York City Bar Association, it was formed as the Association of Bar of the City of New York in 1870, largely to oppose Boss Tweed and seek judicial independence. It did well enough that by 1896 it was able to have this building completed, which is now a national landmark. We have about 25,000 members at this point, with 160 committees, of which 17 are devoted to international or cross-border matters. The newest of those is the Committee on Middle Eastern and North African Affairs, founded less than 2 years ago, and I have the privilege of being its inaugural chair, which is in turn why I have the privilege of being your moderator tonight. I actually, at this point, was going to welcome some special guests, but we have so many tonight, and we only have 3 hours, that we're actually going to have to pass that section. Our topic tonight could not be more timely. I think it's safe to say no current conflict in the world occupies. Fantastic. As I was saying, it's safe to say that no other conflict now in the world gets more attention than the one initiated by the self-proclaimed Islamic State, also known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, and ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and its acronym in Arabic, Daesh. This self-styled new Islamic caliphate has framed its legitimacy on its interpretation of 1,400-year-old principles of Islam that originally supported the amazingly swift conquest of lands reaching from what is now southern France in the west all the way to Pakistan, and all completed within 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 632 AD. It is this model that ISIS seeks to replicate, starting in Syria and Iraq, and now Libya, and through its allies in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, and ultimately globally. And while missiles and bombs and boots on the ground are essential to oppose them, many believe that we will not be able to really stop them without also winning the battle for hearts and minds. And that is a fight that must commence with understanding the issues involved, which is the goal of this program, and hopefully many more. In fact, this is the 12th program featuring Islamic law issues we presented in this great hall, plus 4 CLE programs. Since 2005, when I formed the Islamic Law Subcommittee of this association, when I chaired its Committee on Foreign and Comparative Law. Our first program was titled History and Development of Islamic Law, and I'm very pleased to note that 2 of the 4 brilliant members of that groundbreaking 2006 panel are here again tonight on this dais. Our program has 4 distinct parts. The first part is because I've learned that our audience usually comprises a great spectrum of understanding of the basic tenets of Islamic law and Islam, and the major denominations of Islam. So I will open with just that. Then, with my part being a glossary for you to use for the other speakers, we will turn to our 2 preeminent experts from 2006, Professors Mohede and Freeman, who will take head-on ISIS's claims of observance of and conformity with Orthodox Sunni doctrines of Sharia as to jihad, the caliphate, and the treatment of slaves, captives, and infidels. But since ISIS is not just a legal argument, but a political reality, Part 3 will be the extraordinary opportunity to hear from an important member of the MENA Region's political world, His Excellency Ambassador Ahmed Consul General Beecher to New York, who will talk about the development of the political philosophy of radical Islam that ISIS also uses to justify, in theological and legal terms, its ambitions. Then finally, since as Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach, in modern parlance that means it needs financing. And Dr. Helen Malko will illuminate one important way that ISIS feeds itself, through pillaged antiquities, so that Barbara Hoffman can explain to us the international legal aspects there. So my first job as moderator is an uncomfortable one, introducing myself. Robert Eli Michael, Brown 69 and NYU 74, delayed by an involuntary 2 years in the U.S. Army after my 1 year. I've already mentioned the 2 committees and 1 subcommittee I have or am chairing here. But I also was for many years the chair of the Islamic Law Committee of ABILA, the American branch of the International Law Association, which is almost as old as this institution. And while I'm an adjunct professor of law at Pace Law School, where I've taught for a number of years, the first thing we address is how is Islamic law made? Where does it come from? First place it comes from, the most important place it comes from, is the Quran. The highest source of all laws, rules, and modes of conduct for all Muslims. Revealed orally to the Prophet Muhammad by the Archangel Gabriel in private appearances from 610 to 632 AD, it was then compiled and written down after his death. By its terms, it's the Second Amendment of the Jewish Torah and the New Testament, the New Testament being the First Amendment. As a result, Jews and Christians have an elevated status as people of the book. Has approximately 500 legal and quasi-legal verses scattered through 11 plus chapters called surah. There are 2 main parts, the Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs, based on where the Prophet was living and received these words of God at the time. Originally, his birthplace was Mecca, and then due to certain political events, he fled to Medina. Medina is actually short for Medina Yathrib, the city of the Prophet. Disputes between the creationists who believe that the Quran, similarly to the Jewish and Christian Bibles, was divinely inspired but written by men, except where it says, and the Lord said, and the revelationists who held that it was the actual revealed Word of God in its entirety, ended with the acceptance of the revelationist position, so that it is accepted universally by Muslims that the Quran is the literal Word of God. Now, the next level of the creation of law, of Islamic law, is what are known as the hadith, or prophetic sunnah, the traditions, those things that are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad having been said or did. Originally, that was a much more expansive concept, and there's suggestion there's maybe 500,000 that applied to the Prophet and his 40 companions at the time. There was then a consolidation due to the victory of the traditionists over the rationalists, and that was weaned down to only those that can be accurately attributed as best they could to the Prophet himself. So that is the second level, and you hear a lot when you talk about Islamic law about the hadith, the traditions, and which says this and which says that. They then proceeded similarly a compensation down of authorities, because there were a lot of people, a lot of experts, a lot of leaders who had different thoughts, and ultimately that was reduced down to 4 separate schools. And here again people talk about the Hanafi school, the Hanbali school, etc. There are 4, and they're listed there. That was over the first 200 years following the death of the Prophet, and that is known as the formative period. And you will see later on, it also says on the slide, I won't go through it, what countries tend to have which schools now as their dominant school. Now, among the Shia, there's the next level of law given by their imams, whether they're 5, 7, or 12, depending on the sect of Shiism. And they have a status, the imams, and they're all footnotes, 12th imam, that there are those lawgivers, and their rulings created law just below that of the Prophet. So then, what about everything that isn't included in those? The next level of lawmaking is consensus, ijma, of the scholars, the ulama. Now there is a certain amount of dispute as to whether it has to be all scholars of all time, all scholars alive at the time, or most critical for those involved in Islamic finance today, only those scholars who know the topic, because that reduces it from all the authorities in the world to maybe at most 100, I think probably men, around the world who are considered scholars for the purposes of Islamic finance and establishing what is a matter of law in that area. Now, as practicing lawyers, the next level is how do things get decided at the dispute resolution and modern, or not just modern, historic level. And that is a process in which the judge, the qadi, makes a decision that is binding but not precedential, based on arguments made to him based on legal opinions. The word almost all of you have heard, fatwa, plural fatwa. Those are not edicts, they are not rulings of law among the Sunni. They are legal opinions, opinion letters, and people are entitled to go fatwa shopping and find the mufti, the jurisconsult. Those of you familiar with the German legal system, it's a role that is not dissimilar from that played by the Max Planck Institute in Germany, often called jurisconsults. They provide informative advice that the judge can follow or not follow. And the credence given tends to be directly related to the reputation of the issuer. Now, among the Sunni, those fatwa are permanent, and there are collections of them going back hundreds of years, so that you can see what this expert, that expert said about something. Among the Shia, fatwas, because of the hierarchical nature of Shiism, and we'll talk about that a little later, the fatwas have more binding authority on people who follow the issuer in the hierarchy. And when I first wrote this, I was actually sure the next statement that they expired with the issuer, but I recently read an article provided me by Professor Morhede, who has illuminated me that over the last 50 years, 100 years, that tradition has broken down somewhat, and there's now some continuity and longevity in Shia fatwas. The process implied then is a matter of analogy and following up the line. It's very much more similar to the civil law approach than the common law approach, in that you go from the law to the facts versus from the facts to the law. And then the last version is a matter of customary law, which isn't technically law but provides guidance. So that's how Islamic law is arrived at. The decisional process, and this next slide is really large for among the Sunnah historic, because as I said, there really hasn't been the true capacity to do this for about 1,000 years. And interesting, Professor Morhede will explain to you all about jihad soon. And you can see in this word ijtihad, that it also is based on the concept of jihad or struggle. It's how you find what the law is, how you adjudicate a case, and how to find the law. Now, when there is no law, and finding the interstices in the law is the job of a mujtahid, someone qualified to do this. And among the Sunni, there really haven't been any for 1,000 years. Among the Shia, because of the hierarchical nature, the Ayatollah, the sign of God, or the Grand Ayatollah for all of his followers, has that power, and then it becomes binding on those below. So that's, again, in the tiniest, not even in a nutshell, it's in that little tiny grain in the middle of the nut, in the middle of the nutshell of Islamic law. And the same will be true for the rest of this presentation. So basically, in Islamic law, you have 5 categories of actions. And you can see from haram, which is forbidden, down to that which is obligatory. And in between, you have things that are permissible, discouraged, and recommended. And the relevance of that we'll see in a minute. So now, the other thing important to remember is classical Islamic law, true traditional Sharia, does not exist anywhere. It has not been so since probably colonial times, and I don't mean colonial times here, I mean colonial times in the MENA region. Even where it is the organic law and as based on Sharia, such as in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the law today is an amalgam of classical Islamic law and modern Western-inspired law, based usually either on UK, US common law, or French or German civil law. These hybrid systems also involve aspects of modern international law, often from multilateral treaties and conventions like the WTO and TRIPS. For example, classical Sharia, there's no such classical Islamic law. There are no intangible assets, so obviously there's no law applicable to intellectual property, but in every country in the region, and said Saudi Arabia is a member of the WTO, you do have aspects now of intellectual property law that are just not technically consistent with classical Sharia. There's no bright line separating civil law and criminal law and ecclesiastical law. An important aspect of all legal elements, and it's important to also understand that Islam is a contract-based religion, is that social justice and fairness is required in all elements, in all dealings, both family and commercial. There are some interesting elements that a lot of you may have heard of that are quite anti-capitalistic. The prohibition on paying or collecting of interest, the lack of time or risk value of money, speculation, limited liability, and as I mentioned, intangible rights and assets, and that you can't finance what you cannot do yourself. On the other hand, there are also strong
This probably is the greatest book of medieval Islamic constitutional law, Mawardi. I think it's all available in English now. I'm not sure. It was written by the Sunni jurist Mawardi, died in 1058. It lists a number of qualifications for the caliphate. Soundness of mind, learning, probity are some of the expected qualifications of a good ruler. Descent from the tribe of the prophet, the Quraysh, was, however, a qualification born from an attempt over many generations to confirm that the evolution of the caliphate had been essentially correct. The first four caliphs, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, were all descendants of the prophet's large tribe, the Quraysh. Shortly before Mawardi, another caliphate was founded in Egypt, the Fatimids. They claimed legitimacy through their direct descendant from the from the companion of the prophet, Ali, the closest male relative of the prophet in many ways, who was married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima. That's why they're called Fatimids. They were the ancestors of the, as has been said by Bob, ancestors of the present Aga Khan. Another group of Shiites, the Twelvers, considered the rightful caliph to have disappeared as the 12th Imam in 941, a period in which the option to become caliph looked extremely unattractive because the Abbasid caliphs were more or less pushed around by their palace guard. They said that the true caliph would return in the fullness of time to be the Messiah, the Mahdi. These are the Shiites of Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, fair number in South Asia as well. Yet a third group of Shiites, the Zaydis, existed and continue to exist in the Yemen. They really have stakes in the Yemen from the 3rd Islamic century, the 9th century, Common Era. They believe that any descendant of Ali, and there are many, who has learning and the will to fight can establish a caliphate. Shiites prefer the term imam to the term caliph, but the two are virtually interchangeable. The Yemeni Shiites had an imam as a ruler until 1964, and the Houthis, who were all over the news today, are Zaydi Shiites. Mawardi and similar jurists had so strongly insisted on the existence of a caliphate to at least nominally appoint the de facto rulers of the Islamic world, and indeed we have from the 10th century, we have Islamic kingship everywhere, that the sultanship, that the extinction of the Abbasid line in Baghdad by the Mongols, who did not believe in Islam, in 1258 left a legal vacuum in the minds of some Muslims. This legal vacuum was not strongly felt or equally felt by all areas of the Islamic world. The rulers of North Africa, a Sunni dynasty called the Al-Muwahhidun or Almohads, as they become known in Western literature, even assumed the title caliph before the end of the Abbasids. Another solution used by the Mamluk rulers of Egypt, that's from 1260 to 1517, was to keep a tame descendant of the Abbasids in Cairo who could appear on ceremonial occasions and deputize the Mamluk sultans to rule. A prominent jurist of the period, at the bottom of the slide, Ibn Jama'ah, even suggested that a sultanate was virtually a caliphate, thereby elevating Islamic kingship to a higher religious status. Also characteristic of this later period is the designation by rulers of their capital cities as Darul Khilafa, the home of the caliphate, and creating an anticipation that these rulers might at some point claim to be caliphs. A new phase arrived with the Ottomans of 1299 to 1924. There is a story that the last Abbasid shadow caliph in Cairo handed his office to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I on the latter's conquest of Cairo in 1517. True or not, the Ottomans occasionally used caliphal titles, although their authority did not primarily rest on this claim. However, in a treaty with the Russians in 1774, as a counterpart to the assertion by the Russian czars that they were the protectors of the Orthodox Christians inside the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultan added language which stated that the Ottoman rulers was the supreme religious head of Islam. With the spread of European colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottomans remained one of the very few independent Muslim governments standing, making the Ottoman claim to the caliphate more meaningful to Muslims outside the Ottoman realm. After the defeat of the Ottomans in the First World War, the Ottoman Sultan was stripped of his sultanate in 1922, but it was only stripped of his title as caliph in 1924. Returning to an earlier period to talk about theories of jihad, the most important foundational jurist in many ways, and I work in the field of Islamic jurisprudence, usul fiqh, among other things, was the great jurist Shafi'i, who died in 820 in Egypt, actually. In Cairo, you can go to see the tomb of Imam Shafi'i. This very great jurist said that ideally the Islamic realm should expand. It was believed in expansion of the Islamic realm, but it was only something that would be accomplished as an eschatological hope. That is, at the end of time, when the Messiah comes, would the entire world be turned into a Muslim realm. He recognized that beside the world of Islam and the world of non-Islam, there was the world of treaty, ahad. That's on the slide, yes. On this basis, some Muslim modernists have developed the theory that as members of the United Nations, we are all, from the Islamic point of view, in the world of treaty. Other Islamic modernists, including the recently deceased doyen of Arabic Muslim jurist Wahba Zuhaili, in my opinion, I admire him immensely, have argued that the verse of the sword does not abrogate the earlier Quranic verse, and have vigorously revived the theory that jihad is defensive only. Then there is the jihad theory of the radical and often militant Islamists. They have, until recently, believed that there is no legitimate Islamic government in the world, and that every Muslim is in a face-to-face combat with a pagan enemy. Ayman Zawahiri said this very explicitly. On this basis, they ignore the strong and long-standing Muslim rejection of suicide and blow themselves up to kill others. Now that some radical Islamists, such as the so-called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, his real name is Ibrahim Badri, have established things they call states, they still support suicide bombing beyond their borders. In the last years of Ottoman rule, and during the onset of World War I, the Ottoman Sultan Caliph declared a jihad against the British, while the British persuaded some Muslim authorities in India to declare jihad against the Ottomans. I think this shows how hollow the idea of jihad has become. The threat to the Ottomans, to the Ottoman Caliphate in the early 1920s caused a flurry of activity in British India, which saw the Khilafat movement in India, which developed an anti-colonial tone and hence was supported by many non-Muslims, such as the Hindu Mahatma Gandhi. There were a few unsuccessful bids for the Caliphate after the Ottomans resigned the title in 1924. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem called a congress in that city in 1931, but his bid had no momentum whatsoever. A more serious attempt was made by King Fuad of Egypt. However, in resistance to his claim, a religiously learned Egyptian intellectual, a very intelligent man, Ali Abdel-Razak, published a book in 1925 that dismissed the idea that it was a necessity to have a caliph or caliphate as an essential part of Islam. This view has existed as a minority opinion, it was even said by some people at the time of Abu Bakr, since earliest Islamic times, but was given influence by both Abdul-Razak's book and by the rise of independent national states and nationalism. However, nostalgia for the golden age of the caliphate remains strong among Muslims. Such a caliphate, imagined as the period of the first four caliphs or the early Abbasids, was seen as a period of strength, wealth, and above all piety, in which Muslims lived in harmony and their rulers were truly just. It was, as a historian, I have to say that's not a correct picture of this early period, but never mind, that's how it was remembered. Yet, few Muslims imagined that anyone could ever make a plausible claim to this office, much less establish a state from Mali to Indonesia. Pan-Islamic conferences, which have existed over the past century and continue to exist, show that Muslims differ widely in their political orientations and aspirations. I met, some of our Egyptian friends, I met Sheikh Makhlouf. He was an extremely old man, but he was the He was the Mufti, who was dismissed by through Nasser because he said Islam is not socialism, which he and Nasser disagreed. But anyway, present claimants to the title of caliph include some traditional candidates, such as the ruling family of Morocco. The king of Morocco also is the caliph. He is indeed a descendant of the Caliph Ali, and as is in the king of Jordan, but the king of Jordan doesn't claim to be a caliph. New claimants, however, have risen in recent times. Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, took the title of Commander of the Faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen, in 1996, when he put on a supposed cloak of the Prophet. This title is only given to caliphs, according to many, but Mullah Omar did not directly in his lifetime assume the style of caliph. This is very interesting because after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi started to claim to be a caliph, Ayman al-Zawahiri got some old tape of Mullah Omar saying that he was indeed the caliph. So this was a sort of online battle about who's the caliph. In contrast, the Muslim Brothers, a very significant group in Egypt and elsewhere, evoke the caliphate as a distant future goal for their movement. The fantasy of living in Abbasid times is even more prominent in the symbols of the man who assumed the name Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This name he adopted when he claimed to be a caliph in June 2014. His choice of a black outfit is indeed correct. According to Abbasid standards, the Umayyads wore exclusively white. So, I don't know, he has a PhD in Islamic studies. He's a semi-academic, this man, Ibrahim al-Badri, so I don't know whether he means something by that. Yet, his designation of the Islamic State, Dawlatul Islamiyya, uses a modern Arabic word for the state, Dawla, which does not have this meaning at all in the Abbasid period. Baghdadi's break with Al-Qaeda, which recognizes Mullah Omar and then Ayman al-Zawahiri, though not as caliph, is altogether predictable. Neither Omar nor Baghdadi were educated in religious seminaries, traditional religious seminaries like the Azhar, and their rise represents a rejection of traditional Sunni learned leaders. Heredity. Well, okay. Let me just repeat some points from the talk. Grounds for appointing a caliph. Consultative assembly, shura. But how is that consultative assembly formed? Should it be done by election by Muslims all over the world? Should it be done by the crowd immediately around, as was done in the case of Abu Bakr, in the episode called the Saqifa? Should it be done by specific designation, as the Shiites feel? Is it necessary that the caliph be sinless? Can it be hereditary in order to save dissension among Muslims? Should it be the first to receive oaths of allegiance? These are big questions, and nobody has a clear constitutional answer. This is something, one can't say it often enough in the West, that we should recognize that Islam does not have strong hierarchical authority. Sunni Islam in particular does not have strong hierarchical authority. And therefore, there is no pope or bishops or people who can declare people right or wrong. There are opinions among Muslims, and of course the hierarchical authorities that have existed, like the Sheikh al-Azhar, do have opinions, and they're important, but they're by no means decisive for most Muslims. So we have to think of Islam more on the model of rabbinic Judaism, actually, where there are leaders, there are sheikhs, there are authorities, but there is not a clear way to say that Muslims believe in this kind of caliphate, this kind of process. Anyway, so we've said heredity is a fairly constant element in discussion about the caliphate, but it is determinative only among the Twelver and Ismaili Shiites. And even for them, it must be confirmed by specific designation. Among the Sunnis, there has been a long and strong sentiment in favor of the consultative assembly, shura. And the democratic aspirations have added to the sentiment in favor of this idea of consultative assembly in the last century and a half. Caliph Omar had some, Mullah Omar had some associations with a group of Taliban leaders called the Quetta Shura, or the Quetta Consultative Assembly. Conversely, the would-be Iraqi Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has declared that he is a descendant of Ali. Interesting, because if it's true, he's a descendant through the 11th Shiite Imam who lived in Samarra, where he lives, where he comes from. Since there is no agreement as to how to appoint a caliph, and such a wide variety of Muslim authorities exist, it seems to me very unlikely that any widely accepted modern caliphate will arise. As for the theory of jihad, it has evolved, it is still evolving. As I said, this book by Wahba Zohaili, Athar al-Harb, it's called in Arabic, is a book that would be completely against the ideas of this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It's by somebody many hundred times more learned than he is. And yet, of course, the final decision is among Muslims themselves. Thank you for your attention.
We now turn to my friend and MENA committee member, Professor Bernard Freeman. Perhaps even more despicable than the public broadcast of beheadings of non-combatants by ISIS is the flagrant and almost equally public use of slavery. Yet they justify both as being supported by classical rules of Sharia. We are therefore very fortunate to have with us Professor Freeman, probably the world's leading authority on slavery in Islam. Bernard, who has inspired and mentored virtually all our efforts over the years in understanding Islamic law here at the Association, is a professor of law and the director of the program for the study of law in the Middle East of Seton Hall Law School. A graduate of Wesleyan and Rutgers Law School, Professor Freeman received both his LLM and JSD degrees from Columbia, where his dissertation was concerned with conceptions of equality in Islamic law and their relation to the problem of slavery in Islamic legal history. More recently, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale, and his forthcoming book is entitled Islam, Slavery, and Empire in the Indian Ocean World. The courses he offers at Seton Hall include Islamic jurisprudence, legal implications of the recent Middle East revolutions, law in the modern Middle East, and notably, slavery, human trafficking law. His topic, therefore, tonight is slavery and the treatment of captives, prisoners, and infidels in Islamic law.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's an honor and a privilege to present this topic to you, and I trust the same will be true for you when I'm finished. And I'll have the same issue that Roy had, which is to try and make this machine move. Okay. it's very hard to follow this excellent talk that Professor Montahede gave us about the caliphate, and I'm going to just take a narrow slice and be more contemporary, although I will rely to some extent on some of the same areas of Islamic history that Professor Montahede relied upon. But I'm going to take a narrow view and look just at the problem of slavery. My research and writing has more and more concerned itself with the fact that slavery in Islamic law and Islamic cultures is a problem, has been a problem for some time. It was a problem in Western jurisprudence and a problem in the East as well, but it still remains a problem in Islamic cultures and Islamic law and in the legal history, mainly a problem of understanding. And then we have the advent of ISIS, and ISIS then, as part of its ideology, seeks to revive slavery. And ISIS sees the abandonment, as they call it in their literature, of slavery as an abandonment of the Sharia. So they equate slavery and the ability of soldiers and other partisans of the imperium to capture people as being part and parcel of their mission. And I think it's also not lost on the people that are controlling ISIS that it makes a particular impact on us in the West, because unlike in the Islamic world, we've been through, especially Americans, have been through a moral conflagration over slavery. Slavery is still very much, the history of slavery is still very much an issue in our culture. And so by reviving it, it's one additional way, in addition to beheading people and stealing antiquities, it's one other way that they can reassert this approach that they've taken. So I want to look at the problem of slavery as developed by ISIS. And I wish really that I could be able to give this talk to mostly Muslims, because much of what I will say would really be appropriate for Muslims to be concerned with. But people who are friendly with and talk to Muslims, and I know there are some Muslims in the audience, it's a very important topic. I think it's the weakest link in the ISIS ideology. They're weakest and where they're most vulnerable in terms of their ability to capture hearts and minds in the Muslim world is on the question of slavery. As Professor Montahede talked about, there's a nostalgia among Muslims for the caliphate, and ISIS is taking advantage of that nostalgia to some extent. But on the question of slavery, they are really beyond the pale. And so I think it's a place where Islamic governments, Islamic opinion leaders, Islamic jurists, and ordinary Muslims can have a real effect on changing the approach that ISIS. I don't think ISIS is going to go away, or this kind of thing is going to go away, but we probably have to change that approach, we Muslims, from the inside. So the first thing I want to do is to present, I'm going to start my talk with some pictures, just to set the frame for what's happening. And this is Mr. Michael chastised me for starting off my talk with pornography. It's not really pornography, it's an Orientalist painting. It's an Orientalist painting of the sale of a slave in the 19th century, painted by, I think, a French artist. And it depicts, and this was the idea of slavery and the idea of concubinage and things like that was exoticized and romanticized by people in the West, especially artists and people who wrote literature in the 19th century. And this is an example of it. And it's given in such a way, there's the slave dealer who's talking to the noble who's wondering whether to buy this woman. She is barely clothed or not clothed at all. There are other women sitting waiting their turn, and so it's given this kind of kind of a almost romantic approach. Edward Said, the scholar, the late Edward Said railed against this kind of description of what happens in the Islamic world. But I think that there are some Muslims who have actually signed up for it, but the reality is not the same as what is depicted in this painting. So this is just for talking purposes. Here we have 3 Yazidi women. The Yazidis are non-Muslim, non-Christian, non-Jewish, Kurdish-speaking people who live in northern Iraq and northern Syria and southern Turkey and parts of Iran. And they are, according to the photo that was given, this photo that was taken, are waiting to be sold in a market somewhere in northern Iraq, probably either in Mosul or in Raqqa. And this is a lot different from that Orientalist depiction of what goes on. Here's a woman who is being auctioned by ISIS partisans. You notice she has chains, and she's also wearing the niqab, face covering, and she's to some extent resisting what's happening. He has a bullhorn announcing her sale, as well as he's using the cane to keep her under control. Here we are. This is taken from a video, from an ISIS video. And the ISIS partisans, soldiers, see the ISIS flag on the second floor? This is an apartment block that was apparently occupied by a good number of Yazidi families. And what the ISIS men are doing are separating the women from the men in the families. You see there, it's kind of fuzzy, but you can see there's one girl there who is resisting. And she does not want to go, and that's a fairly horrible set of circumstances. This picture circulated on the internet. I'm not sure who took it. This is a father who has lost his wife and his daughters into slavery as a result of the actions of the ISIS partisans. And some people actually would think, well, it's not true. Is it only fathers and husbands who are concerned? And that's not true. We have here, there were some demonstrations against the actions of ISIS in relation to slavery, and this is a young woman who posts a photograph, posts a poster, hoping that her kidnapped sister will be returned. Not unlike Michelle Obama when she held up the picture with respect to the kidnapping of women, Bring Back Our Girls campaign for Boko Haram. I argue that that is the same problem. The Boko Haram problem and the problem with ISIS, those are the same, it's the same kind of problem. So what are we dealing with? This is a little bit of an overview. I gave a brief version of this talk at Hofstra Law School earlier today, and one of the comments of the students is that we couldn't read your font, so I hope you can read it. It's been increased. This is just going to give you an overview of my talk. And I'm going to start with, after the photos, a few facts, and then deal with one phrase in the Quran that's important when it comes to slavery, the Arabic phrase, ma malakat aymanukum. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about slavery, the law on slavery and slave trading in Islamic law. I'll talk about what ISIS's argument is with respect to that, and then do some history, especially focusing on Salafism and history in Islam, and offer some conclusions. And that's how we will proceed. So a few salient facts about ISIS, which many of you probably already know. It's in the popular press, but just so we know what we're dealing with. It's an entity, a geopolitical entity that seizes territory. Unlike most previous Islamic jihadist groups, it actually seizes territory and exercises suzerainty, or some kind of, if it can, sovereignty over that territory, They now control territory in Iraq and Syria, the size of the state of Indiana. Large swaths of territory in the northern Sinai Peninsula. A 130-mile coastline in Libya, and several other smaller areas of territory around the Muslim world. Number two, it is transnational in the sense that it is moving partisans and members. I'm not sure how they manage to move people and move leaders and move decision makers, but they've been moving people between Syria and Libya into the Sinai, and with some degree of efficiency. And so they've established, I think at last count, 8 so-called provinces that mimics what the Abbasid Caliphate did initially by establishing provinces. Also the Umayyad Caliphate before it established provinces or places where it could put down its feet. And the ISIS entity is doing the same thing. There are at least 3,000 people that are enslaved right now under the ownership, legal ownership, under Islamic law by their interpretation of it. In ISIS, that's not a lot of people, but it is significant because it is increasing. And as I'll talk about, the ideology that they're using is likely to cause, as we are able to deal with it, an increase in the number of enslaved persons. And they also engage in a state practice of the subjugation of religious minorities based on Islamic, their interpretation of Islamic texts. In some cases, it is well justified by Islamic texts, and in other cases, it is not. But that's part of their policy, which is to subjugate non-Muslims in the territories that they control. So in the Quran, we have this verse. We have a good number of verses on slavery, but I just want to focus on one phrase that's used at least 14 times in the Quran, and that's the phrase "Ma malakat aymanukum," which is translated by most to say, "Those whom your right hands possess." Most of the verses that deal with that topic in the Quran are emancipatory. You can marry someone of those who your right hands possess, especially if you cannot afford to marry a free woman, as long as she is a believer. If you give charity, among those who are deserving of charity are those who your right hands possess. So actually, it's an idiomatic phrase that is very specific in terms of who it's dealing with and what the permissions are with respect to those persons. But it also, at the same time, even though those phrases are emancipatory, they also confirm the existence of concubines and others, and mostly in domestic circumstances, who are in that state of enslavement. The idea of using the right hand and the phrase in Arabic of those who your right hands possess gives the connotation that this is a positive relationship. Because if you possess something in your right hand, in the Arab and Muslim way of thinking, that is the better place for the thing to be. So it gives a positive or happy or pleasant kind of connotation, but at the same time, it expresses the idea that slavery, at the time that the Quran was revealed, is a fact of life, fact of legal, cultural, and social life in that circumstance. The Quran doesn't talk much about property, actually, and I've discovered in my research that the most common use of the idea of property in the Quran is in relationship to regulations on slavery. And this is just one example of that. There are a good number of other circumstances. So this is an idiom that's used by ISIS that is fraught with much meaning, much cultural, religious, and legal meaning. Although most of the phrases, as I've described, are actually emancipatory. How those who your right hands possess are to be freed, which I think ISIS ignores to some extent, but it is a fact of the revelation. So what do we have here? I was experimenting with the font, so forgive me for some of it being out of size, but what do we have then in terms of the Islamic law, really jumping? There's a whole lot else I can talk about in terms of the Quran, but what do we have that if someone were to ask me, the man from Mars were to ask me, what is it about Islamic law and slavery, how would you sum up the Islamic law of slavery? And I've done it here as best I could with respect to this slide. Number one, there is a presumption of freedom for all human beings. If there is no knowledge as to the state that the human being is born into, there's a presumption in Islamic law, much like in Roman law, that the presumption is one of freedom. But absent some positive, direct rule authorizing slavery, then the jurist must conclude, or a judge must conclude, that the person is free. Number two, before Islam, there were many ways one could enter into slavery. And I can just give some quick examples. The common ones, capture and war, or birth, but also foundling, abandoned by parents, debt slavery, one who owes a debt, like in the Jewish law, and has to try to satisfy the debt as a remedy for bankruptcy, as a remedy for sin, as a remedy for crime, to do penance, religious penance, all kinds of ways that one can come into slavery, very few ways to get out. Islam changed that significantly. The Islamic jurists, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, reduced the ways that one could enter into slavery into only two. And they are in bold print there on that slide. Either you were born of two enslaved parents, not one enslaved parent, but two enslaved parents, lawfully enslaved, or captured in a lawful jihad. If you came into slavery in those two circumstances, then the slavery was considered to be illegal. Thirdly, there was a great emphasis, and I've talked about, in the Quran on emancipation, whereas the prior rules of law, most, the Roman, the Hebrew, the Hindu, and East African systems of slavery emphasized entry into slavery, and very little was done in terms of egress. Islam changed the focus to emancipation. Number four, one of the most important rules which relates to our talk today, is the rule which is established by the Caliph Omar after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and that's the rule of the Walid. Walid in Arabic, al-Walid, means mother of the child. So if a woman is enslaved by a man and owned by a man, and he has sexual intercourse with her, and she gives birth to a child, that birth causes two legal events automatically. One, the child is free, not enslaved, and the equal of the child of a lawful marriage. And two, the woman cannot be sold and is automatically free at the death of her owner. So this was a reform done by the Omar that greatly accomplished a lot of things. One of the things it did, though, was to establish the children of these unions to be extremely influential in Islamic society, and an acceptance of slave heritage is not necessarily a negative. For example, Jonathan Brockup, who I think is up at Bard College right now, pointed out, and I have verified this, another scholar named Fredrickson also verified it, that of the 37 Abbasid caliphs that Professor Motahade talked about, 34 were the products of these concubinal unions. Only 3 were born marriages. 34 came from an enslaved mother. So this was a completely different attitude towards slavery, and had a kind of a paradoxical impact on Islamic empire. There's no mention of slave trading in the Quran. It doesn't talk about slave trading. Actually, the Prophet Muhammad condemned slave trading. Capture of a free person, he condemned. But there was slave trading at that time, and so the jurists developed a robust system of law to govern slavery and slave trading in those circumstances. So ISIS now, I jump way ahead to today, they come forward with in their propaganda, and they are basically saying, they talked about their approaches to slavery in 3 categories here on this kind of very basic slide: theologically, ideologically, and apocalyptically, how they justify slavery. Because what I've skipped over is that the fact that there were all these emancipatory rules created a paradox, as Bernard Lewis has pointed out. So, for example, Sean Marmon at Princeton has said that in the 19th century, the 18th century, early 19th century, the average time that a person stayed in slavery in Cairo, Egypt, was about 10 years, 12 years. They were emancipated. So this created a demand for more slaves, constant demand for more slaves. And this ISIS, to some extent, is ignoring this emancipatory aspect of slavery. What do they use to justify what they are doing? Number one, the Quran and Sunnah. As I'll talk about in a few minutes, Muslim jurists never went through any kind of questioning of the problem of slavery to any great extent. If they were dealing with colonial or Western European abolitionists, they would give lip service to the idea that slavery was not a good thing morally, but internally there was never any moral questioning of the problem of slavery. So if one reads the Quran and Sunnah, from a literal point of view especially, reading as it was read in the 7th century, it's very easy to say slavery under Islamic law is permitted. So that's their theological justification. What's more important are the ideological justifications they use. They realize it's an effective tool in war. Slavery has also always been a tool in war, and so it's effective and accomplishes much. Number two, they argue to other Muslims that the Sharia has been abandoned in most of the world. Most Muslims have abandoned the Sharia. One of the best examples of that is the abandonment of slavery. If we reinstate slavery, they equivocate the reinstation of slavery with the reinstitution of the reinstitution of Sharia values. Thirdly, they argue that concubinage, owning a woman, because most of the activities that ISIS does is focused on women in slavery, as was true during Islamic history, as opposed to transatlantic slavery, where the object was male, because we needed people to work in the fields. But in the Islamic world, the object of the slave trade was the woman. And they argue that concubinage and owning a woman in this circumstance is a positive thing, and much better than the so-called, the way they argue it, prostitution and moral degradation that we have here in the West. And lastly, they use this ideology then as a weapon, as a means of recruitment. In the newspaper today, in the New York Times, there's a fairly good article. Sometimes you have to be careful with the New York Times, but this one seems to be pretty good, on the recruitment that ISIS is doing in Africa now, with respect to unemployed, no future, no education, aimless men, young men, in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Chad, and these areas. and the men are moving up to Libya because this idea of having a concubine, of getting a salary in this army, of reviving the Sharia is something which is used as a recruitment tool. So the idea of treating women in these kinds of circumstances is attractive to young men who have no other future in their lives. Last but not least is their apocryphal, which I'm not an expert on it, but their apocalyptic argument that the end of the world is going to happen in Syria in a battle between Muslims and Christians, and that's what they're preparing for. So I have three questions. This is to some extent based on an article I just published in the Fordham International Law Journal, and I ask in that article, and ask the same tonight, three questions. One, there was never a sea change among Muslims, their attitude towards slavery. Should there be a sea change now? Maybe ISIS is the vehicle to raise that issue. Most Muslims have never really confronted the problem of slavery in their jurisprudence and culture. Number two, what about the universalism of international law? What should be the approach of international lawyers to this problem, especially when people are signing up for this entity on the basis of their version of their own religious or domestic law? There's some who argue that international law should be pluralist, that shouldn't be universalist, is that something that should be recognized? And thirdly, most seriously for Muslims, is there any coherency left in Islamic law? It looks as though there's going to be some difficulty with respect to that. So I have some other slides. Bob is telling me my time is coming to an end, and so I'm going to have to quickly do them.
Only your time for speaking.
Okay. I want to just focus on the problem of Salafism in relationship to slavery, because Salafism, which is what Bob talked about, is this idea that we do things like the ancestors did them, and it rejects the schools of law, focus on the so-called madhabs and things like that, and emphasizes the primary texts. And so this idea of history, the ISIS view of history, is something that I think is quite serious and needs to be dealt with. It's an uncritical, atavistic, and self-serving view of history, which Muslims could perhaps undo. So my conclusion is that the problem of ISIS presents a multitude of difficult questions. These questions are especially difficult for the Muslim community. War may not be the answer. It may have to do with the idea of confronting this problem of slavery and exploitation that ISIS is engaging in, and that may be the best area for changing minds with respect to what's happening. Thank you very much.
I've heard Bernard speak many times, in fact, the second time today, and I think that was the best I've heard him. Thank you. We're now especially pleased to be joined by His Excellency Ambassador Ahmed Farouk, Consul General of Egypt in New York. A graduate of Helwan University, Ambassador Farouk received an MA in International Law from Cairo University and a license of law from Cairo University. Ambassador Farouk's long and distinguished career started with the Institute of Diplomatic Studies of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has included being the Ambassador of Egypt to Slovenia and Deputy Assistant Foreign Minister for International Legal Affairs, head of political section of the Embassy of the Arab Republic of Egypt in Tokyo, and Deputy Director in charge of International Legal Affairs and International Treaties Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With that background, Ambassador Farouk is the perfect expert to talk to us about the way that ISIS and other radical Islamist groups have justified their aggressive political activism. In doing so, they overcame a millennium of quietism, both among the Shia by Ayatollah Khomeini to inspire and justify the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and almost a similar amount of time among the Sunni, during which the political powers were effectively separate from the religious. Your Excellency. Can we raise this?
Distinguished guests, initially I would like to thank the Committee of Middle Eastern and North African in New York City Bar, presented by the chair, Mr. Robert Michael, for giving me the chance to be among this distinguished gathering. Tonight, my keynotes will be about the history, philosophy, or ideology, and development of the radical movement in the Middle East. I will do my best to be concise, precise, and to the point, and I will keen as much as possible to state facts, particularly historical facts, to be able to understand the dimension of the recent problem and the current situation, hoping for a possible solution. My keynotes will consist of 3 parts: the history, the contemporary history. I will not dig deeper in the history like Professor Lloyd. The second part is the philosophy or the ideology. And the third part is the strategy. Before going through, I want to draw the attention that the line which connects the 3 parts is the conflict between the reformers and the awakeners. Let me define the 2 words very rapidly. The reformers are the people who believe in the national state. They believe that gradual changes through existing institutions can change the society to be able to adapt with the modern world. The awakeners are the people or the groups who believe in the religious state. They camp themselves in both defensive and offensive positions, and they try to convince the societies that they are protecting the religion from the Western ideas come to their homelands under the slogan of modernity. That is the real, and they convince them that is the real threat to the religion. First part, the history. I will take you back approximately 200 years, particularly in 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte led a French military campaign to Egypt. This campaign shaped the routine that prevailed in the country during a long period of stagnation under the Khilafah of Ottoman Empire. Literally, this campaign drew the awareness of the Egyptians to the importance of modernization and development. In 1805, 2 years later, after the departure of the French, raised the name of Muhammad Ali, a self-declared ruler for Egypt without the approval of the Khalifa in Istanbul. He is considered the father of the modern Egypt, the founder of the modern Egypt, for the dramatic reforms he made in all aspects of life. The turning point of Muhammad Ali's time when he sent educational missions of Egyptian students to Europe. This contact resulted in the dawn of Egypt Renaissance. We call it in Arabic An-Nahda. 1879, 40 years later, was the peak period of Muhammad Ali dynasty. One of his successors, actually his sons, called Ismail, and they used to call him Ismail the Magnificent, hailed a new era of bringing Egypt into modernity. Mega economic project, he dig the Suez Canal, the French, Ferdinand de Lesseps. He built the downtown of Cairo, copy-paste like the downtown of Paris, built new cities across Egypt, led a huge cultural movement, built in Cairo Opera House, daily, regular newspapers, theaters, movie industry. At that point, the conflict between the reformers and the awakeners in the contemporary history started. But the awakeners, who were representing at that time the Ottoman Empire, the Khilafah in Istanbul, were so weak. And the Ottomans at that time was labeled as the sick man of Europe. And the role played by Muhammad Ali dynasty was so vital to promote reforms. Egypt started a new era of modernization, very strong parliament, very strong political parties, real democracy. Historians were describing Egypt at that time as a part of Europe. 1928, the Awakeners restarted again, and they formed a group named the Muslim Brotherhood. At this point, I will move to the second part of my keynote, which is the ideology or the philosophy. 1928, Hassan al-Banna, a school teacher, with a group of his colleagues in Ismailia city. Ismailia, one of the cities that established by Ismail the Magnificent after his name, Ismailia. He founded this Hassan al-Banna, he founded the Muslim Brotherhood group as the first religious group. Why? This group was founded to confront the influence of the modern Western state on the Islamic countries, particularly Egypt. Especially after the First World War and the total collapse of the Khilafah presented by the Ottoman Empire. They felt that they lost. At that time, after the First World War, Egypt was the safe haven of many European communities. They were fleeing their country. Europe was a war zone, and they used to come to Egypt with their families, with their businesses, with their backgrounds, traditions, and they used to melt with the Egyptian society in all aspects of life. And the Awakeners consider this a real threat to the culture and the tradition of an Islamic country like Egypt, and they have to defend the Egyptians from the invasion of the Western and modernity under the slogan of defending the religion. As I promised, I will stick to historical facts. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the group, the one who set the ideology, wrote 5 books: The Brotherhood and the Community, The Muslim Woman, Education of Youth, and another, he wrote several messages. The most famous of these messages was the 50 Points Manifesto. This message became the doctrine and the creed, not only of the group, but for all the radicals groups that we are listening about it nowadays. It covered all aspects of life, the message, economic, social, political. And he sent it to all the Islamic rulers across the Muslim world. They start to have followers and fans across the Middle East. Let me quote a very brief example of this message. Of course, I will not go through 50 manifesto. I don't have the luxury of time. I'm quoting: eliminating foreign spirit of the West in terms of culture, tradition, language, customs, and fashion, and the way of life. Monitoring movies, theaters, novels, and make good selection of what displays on the nation of programs. Prevent mixing between male and female in education with a different curriculum. Increase the number of youth groups and inflame the enthusiasm for jihad to pave the way for the departed Khilafah. End of quote. From the previous quotations, we can conclude that the Brotherhood group created the ideology of the new political Islam in the contemporary history. They announced their agenda aiming for three basic principles, according to the references, teachers, books, messages, and it is very well acknowledged and they don't deny it. The first basic principle is to fight the concept of the modern state. The second, reviving the Khilafah, the Islamic State, based on the Sharia law. The third basic principle is the jihad. And let me explain this very briefly, the word jihad. Jihad, as we learned in our school in Egypt, is a self-struggle. Struggle from within, to be a good person, not to covet your neighbor, not to lie, to be, at the end of the day, a good person. Jihad is our way. Death in that way is our greatest hope. Signature Hassan al-Banna. Starting from the 30s and through the 40s, Egypt started to know the organized terrorist political crime. After al-Banna's death in 1949, actually killed, New York Times in February 13, 1949, page 1, described his organization as a political movement with mystic and fascist overtones, and described his supporters as fanatics. 60 years later, actually January 2016, British government published a report about the Muslim Brotherhood activities. I will start quoting from the report. While the Brotherhood, pretending non-violent methods on the grounds of expediency, they are prepared to countenance violence, including from time to time terrorism. And the report concludes, quoting, the aspects of Brotherhood ideology and tactics in this country, Britain, and overseas, are contrary to our values, our national interests, and our national security. I'll be back to history, and I stop at 1949. In the 50s, took the lead of the Muslim Brotherhood Sayyid Qutb, another name. Of course, he developed the ideology. He formed an armed wing for the Brotherhood. He wrote his famous book, Milestones, which set the rules of the violent jihad. He produced a new vision, showing full conflation between religion and politics to reach the religious state. The state derives its legitimacy not from the community or people, but from religion and religion only. Signed, Sayyid Qutb. During the 60s, and after the Brotherhood failed trial to assassinate President Nasser, the group was banned and all its leaders, almost all of them, were jailed and Qutb was executed. In 1970, again the ideology developed when President Sadat tried to accommodate the Muslim Brotherhood and invited them to work into politics on one condition: to renounce violence. They did. Same year, same members. They formed three other groups as an offshoot of the main group, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. The three groups were Al-Jama'a Al-Islamiyya, Al-Jihad, and Al-Takfir wal-Hijra. The groups dedicated their efforts to overthrow Sadat and the Egyptian government and replacing it with an Islamic State. Particularly when Sadat started Camp David peace talks with Israel, which concluded by the peace accords in 1979. In 1980, they assassinated President Sadat. However, the president's assassination alerted all the state institutions that they put into operation a wide crackdown on all Islamist groups. In parallel with a successfully triggered ideological dialogue between Al-Azhar scholars. Al-Azhar is the oldest Muslim university institutions in Egypt that presented the moderate Islam. They triggered an ideological dialogue between Al-Azhar scholars and the jailed leader of the Muslim Brotherhood of Al-Jama'ah Islamiyya, Al-Jihad and Takfir. This move, called the Revision Initiative, was quite successful in producing an authentic stance by a wide circle of terrorist leaders in prisons. The campaign practically paralyzed the groups and halted the terrorist attacks. And during the 80s, the Middle East was almost zero terrorism. By the 90s, two major incidents happened. It gave the kiss of life for the radicals. Number one, the Islamic Revolution of Iran. And number two, the unlimited support of the West to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to counter the Soviets. The ideology again developed, but by new players. Omar Abdul-Rahman and Al-Zawahiri, ex-member of the Brotherhood in Egypt. Zarqawi, member of the Brotherhood in Jordan. Osama bin Laden, member of the Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia. Mullah Omar in Afghanistan. They all gathered in Afghanistan physically and morally for jihad. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the absence of strategy to deal with this well-trained and well-equipped mujahideen, the aftermath in Afghanistan created Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden. They allied with the Taliban of Mullah Omar, and they announced unity with Al-Jama'ah Islamiyya, the first offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And a video was released on internet in year 2000 of Al-Zawahiri announcing unity with Al-Jama'ah Islamiyya. In Afghanistan, with the unity of the groups under Taliban and Al-Qaeda, was literally the first trial to revive the Khilafah on the ground. Year 2000, with the development in communication means through the internet, the spread of ideology and recruitment of jihadists became easier and faster. Al-Qaeda branches appeared in several places. Bin Laden and Al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan, Zarqawi in Jordan, and Omar Abdul-Rahman as a spiritual leader in USA, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of ISIS now, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And again, the ideology developed, and they decided to attack, starting by attack the far enemy, September 11. And as the aftermath and the absence of a strategy in Afghanistan created Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden, the aftermath and the absence of strategy in Iraq created ISIS of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The two groups were once formally allied. With the sophistication and development of social media, forming radical groups became more and more easier. Actually, we can use the term became globally. We find Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Mujahideen in Mali, Ansar Baitul Maqdis in Sinai, and the recruitment process expanded to Asia, United States, Europe, and we can find lone wolves everywhere. They are all following one ideology, the one which set by the mother of all. The ideology set by Hassan al-Banna in 1928 to revive the Islamic State, the Khilafah, of Bakr al-Baghdadi, after 88 years, is doing his best to implementing on the ground. Indeed, each group has a different way, and indeed, each group have a different methods, and naturally have a different name, and they may break with each other from time to time, but they are all carrying one ideology, aiming for one goal. Speaking the same person, wearing different masks. At this point, I will move to the last and third part of my keynotes, which is the strategy. Unfortunately, there is no effective strategy, because we don't know who the enemy that we should fight. Are we going to set a strategy to fight terrorism, or a strategy to fight religion, or a strategy to fight individuals, terrorists? The first easy answer, of course, we are going to set the strategy to fight terrorism. We have another problem. Terrorism has no definition. Everyone, every government defines terrorism according to his own interests. The word is heavily politically charged. What we see them as a terrorist, you see them as a moderate. And what we see them as a terrorist, you see them as a political power on the ground. So, are we going to set the strategy to fight the religion? It's illogical. Because Islam is like any other religion. It's like Judaism, like Christianity. And if we take all of them, we'll find that all of them calling for the same high values: peace, tolerance, peaceful coexistence, respect for each other, aiming to be a good person. Shall we turn the strategy to fight terrorist individuals? Terrorist is a person with a very short life cycle. Recruitment, brainwash, financing, training, arming, and send him at the first mission to execute him. And if we look back, we realize that individuals like Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb were killed, but the Muslim Brotherhood still. Zarqawi and Osama bin Laden killed, but Al-Qaeda still functioning. Al-Zarqawi will be killed sooner or later, but ISIS will continue, either by the same name or a different name. So what we need is an effective strategy must be set to counter the evil ideology. The evil ideology that produces terrorism and terrorists and distort the religion, using it for political gain. Again, we learn from the history that evil ideologies must be defeated, not accommodated. The history facts tells that all the evil ideologies that appeared in the mankind started by the Sicaris at the 1st century till the Nazis at the 20th century, where this appeared because it was defeated, not accommodated. That's the question now, how to defeat the evil ideology. That can only happen if we stand united, delegitimizing their claims by strongly showing that their arguments is rejected, that they have no hope, they have to give up with their thoughts, they have to realize that they cannot be tolerated if they want to live in a civilized world. Conflation of politics with the religion will not going to work. We have to admit that the problem with Islamic fundamentalism is a political problem. It is very important to have a solid, clear, and reliable long-term strategy in collaboration with the reliable partners in the Middle East. A strategy, not tactics. And there is a huge difference between both. A strategy, having an action plan, can be implemented on the ground, not rhetorical theories. A strategy having accurate answers to the following questions. How to prevent the transmission of the evil ideology? How to produce and promote a better ideology? And mobilize the right persons, right people, who are able to conduct and steer the better ideology. The feasibility of using the military instrument. How and where to cut off oxygen of the recruitment process, funding, training, and arming of youth. How to develop international security network systems for protection. How the United States can build trust with its allies in the Middle East to drop the conspiracy theories that commanding the Arab society's mind. How the United States can increase its role effectively to reach solution to the chronic problems in the area, like the Palestinian case, the Iraqi, the Libyan, the Syrian, and the Yemen. By having answers to these questions, we may have an effective strategy. By this, I conclude the three parts of my keynotes. I tried my best to shed the light on historical facts, and it's up to each one his own opinion. And I recall the words of late New York Senator Patrick Moynihan when he said, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts." Thank you.
Thank you. For our final segment, we first turn to Helen Malko, an archaeologist and a research associate at Columbia University. Helen holds a PhD in archaeology and anthropology from Stony Brook University and a master's degree in archaeology of Mesopotamia from Baghdad University, and a diploma in historic preservation from Rutgers. Helen is currently a content manager for the website of the Columbia Project, Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments, in the Department of Art History and Archaeology. This project provides digital records for Mesopotamian standing monuments and facilitates future conservation work to preserve Mesopotamian, I'm saying Mesopotamian 5 times, cultural heritage as a significant part of a global cultural heritage. In addition to her fieldwork in Turkey and Iraq, Dr. Malko coordinated and implemented the Iraq Museum Residency Program at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A strong advocate for cultural heritage preservation and works on documented heritage sites throughout Iraq and the Middle East, Helen has hands-on experience with Iraqi society and culture and has been involved in various training projects to preserve the country's heritage. Helen will illustrate the duplicitous nature of ISIS's activities involving allegedly destroyed monuments. Took a professor of something other than law to really manipulate this thing.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Now with this talk, we will shift a bit to what ISIS actually is doing in regard to cultural heritage and historical sites. So I begin today's presentation with a brief discussion of historical background of Iraq and Syria. Then I'll move to the scale of damage inflicted on both people and cultural heritage by the so-called Islamic State. Finally, I'll conclude with some academic efforts to help preserve this rich and diverse heritage. So the modern nations of Iraq and Syria constitute the region historically known as Mesopotamia, or the land between the two rivers. This area has an extraordinary rich heritage spanning several millennia of eventful history. Cities such as Mosul and Aleppo stand witness to the cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity in this region. Mosul, for instance, is the center of the Nineveh province in northwest of Iraq, about 200 miles north of Baghdad. This province is remarkably fortunate in the possession of a rich and diverse cultural heritage, including more than 1,700 heritage sites of ancient churches, monasteries, mosques, synagogues, as well as relics of ancient Assyrian sites and monuments. And what is highlighted here is only a few examples of many, many other sites that exist throughout this area. In June 2014, ISIS, or Daesh, took control of the Nineveh province and parts of Syria, killing people and destroying religious and cultural sites. Although ISIS has targeted various communities in Iraq and Syria, at greater risk today are the history and survival of the Yazidi and Assyrian communities. The attempts to annihilate these indigenous people of this region are in part enacted through the violent acts of erasure of the past. And by the way, earlier this month, the European Parliament officially declared ISIS offenses against the Yazidi and Assyrian people as an act of genocide. And to that, I would add it is also a cultural genocide. Among the significant historical religious monuments that were destroyed is the Mosque of Nabi Yunus, or the Mosque of Jonah, in Mosul, which presumably housed the grave of the biblical prophet. This was originally a small mosque built on top of a small church dating to the early Christian era. Both the church and the mosque are built on top of partially excavated Assyrian palace, shown here in the upper left image. During the 1980s, Saddam enlarged the old mosque and built up the archaeological site on which it sat, preventing any further excavations. ISIS assault at Nabi Yunus not only destroyed a historical mosque and a church, but also exposed intact Assyrian artifacts and objects that they came out when they blew up the mosque. Most of these objects were looted and most likely were sold on antiquities markets. And on the slide you see a group of objects in the upper right image is Assyrian objects. These are Assyrian objects, and we think that maybe probably similar objects might have came out after they blew up the mosque, but we have no records of any objects whatsoever. Similarly, the monastery of Saint Marbehnam and Sarah, dating to the 4th century AD, was blown up in 2014. Although the monastery had been renovated, parts of the ancient structure were preserved within the new building. It also had one of the most important libraries that housed ancient Syriac manuscripts, which was looted and will probably should end up in private collections in Europe and the United States. The latest in ISIS attacks on heritage sites was the destruction of the 1400-year-old monastery of Saint Mar Elian in Mosul, seen here before its destruction. Approximately 1 year ago, members of ISIS took sledgehammers to smash and topple ancient artifacts in the Mosul Museum as well as archaeological sites. The Mosul Museum is the second largest Iraqi museum. It was established in 1952 to display diverse artifacts dating from prehistoric period through Ottoman period. Although some objects from its collection were removed and brought to Baghdad in 2003, many movable statues and reliefs remained in the museum at the time ISIS attacked. The artifacts that were shown in ISIS videos mainly belong to two groups: the statues from the Roman period site of Hatra or Al-Haba in Arabic, and the Assyrian artifacts from Nineveh and other sites. While some of the artifacts are replicas, others are unfortunately original work of art. Now I'll only show you a few examples of these objects. Here are two statues of two kings from Hatra. On the base of one of the statues, there was an inscription in Aramaic mentioning the name and the titles of the king. Both of them were toppled and broken to pieces. This object is another second one that is coming from this site, and it's known as Torso of Venus. The video does not show ISIS breaking down this object, which suggests that they actually looted this object and have been sold on antiquities market. The second group of artifacts that was destroyed at the museum are those that belong to the Assyrian period, including this pair of winged lions here. Again, their video did not show the militants breaking down these lions, winged lions, but because they are very heavy and large, it's hard to move them and sell them in antiquities market, so most likely they were broken to pieces. ISIS also attacked several ancient Assyrian cities. However, information about the damage is only available for Nineveh and Nimrud. The Nergal Gate, this is just another example of a statue dating to the Assyrian period that was broken by ISIS. However, this example shows a replica object, and you can see that it's replica in comparison to an original Assyrian head that is sitting in the British Museum. But ISIS also attacked archaeological sites, and among them is the Nineveh Gate, Nergal Gate on the north side of Nineveh was attacked, and its wing pools were destroyed, causing irreplaceable damage. This was almost intact, this specific wing pool, or Lamassu as its name is in Akkadian, up until ISIS showed up. The other Assyrian site that was destroyed is Nimrud or Khalfu, one of the most important Assyrian capital cities located in the south of Mosul. This city has a long history of excavations and maintenance. First excavated in the mid-19th century, many wall reliefs and statues were shipped to the British Museum and eventually to other museums in the world, I think including the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. Nimrud was captured by ISIS in late March 2015. Although not fully clear, reports suggest that this group vandalized and looted the site before the massive wall reliefs were cut and destroyed using bulldozers. On April 2nd, 2015, the site was blown up by the militants and was reduced to dust in yet another barbaric act. Moving to Syria, among the most important heritage sites that are under control of ISIS now is Palmyra, a UNESCO heritage site. The history and significance of this city is related to its role as an important trade center on the famous Silk Road during the 1st century AD. The wealth that was brought to Palmyra from trade allowed for the construction of monumental temples, gates, streets, and funerary structures. Reflecting the richness of the city. Here we are looking, the lower picture is Temple Baal, one of the main temples on the site, and the upper picture shows one of the public monuments, buildings, and in the background is sitting the medieval citadel that was built later by the site. ISIS advanced and took control of Palmyra in July 2014, destroying the architectural remains of the ancient city. Here you see the very same Temple Baal, which dates to the Hellenistic period, that it was blown up. And shortly after, ISIS destroyed the best preserved tower tombs on the site that you see on the slide. Finally, although not under ISIS control, the old town and citadel of Aleppo, yet another UNESCO heritage site, have suffered greatly from the ongoing war in Syria. The citadel has a long history going back to the 3rd millennium BC. The standing structures, however, date back to the medieval period. Both the old city and the citadel have been bombed by different parties involved in the conflict. Parts of the citadel wall has been destroyed, as well as the main gate. The old town has been reduced to ruins, and its mosques, churches, and houses are now just piles of stones. The loss of lives and heritage in Iraq and Syria is beyond one's imagination. Yet there is a lot more to the crimes committed by ISIS. The sale of antiquities is believed to be one of ISIS' main source of funding. According to Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, sources on ground provide reports of digging and looting activities conducted by the militants in museums and sites throughout the Nineveh province. It is believed that ISIS destroys large immovable antiquities for ideological purposes and loots small movable pieces such as coins, jewelry, cuneiform tablets for illicit trade. A U.S. raid in eastern Syria in May 2015 demonstrated that ISIS, in fact, is very active in illicit antiquities trade. According to data released by the State Department, a top ISIS financial official was killed, and more than 500 valuable antiquities were discovered in his compound, some you see here on the slide. In addition, documents representing collection receipts for what ISIS calls war booty tax, which is 20% of the value of the antiquities sold, imposed on each transaction, was seized during this raid. And what you're looking at here are the original receipts in Arabic, and then the English translation, and the amount that money ISIS collect is highlighted. A small sample of such receipts indicate that ISIS generated about $265,000 from 11 transactions between December 6, 2014 to March 26, 2015. The U.S. government assessed that ISIS has probably earned several $1 million from antiquities sales since mid-2014, but the exact amount remains undetermined. So how does ISIS control the antiquities trade and ensure the greatest profit? On this slide, you see the organizational structure of ISIS Antiquities Division that was posted by the State Department by the end of last year. It appears that the antiquities trafficking and taxation is controlled by a department called Precious Resources, or Diwan al-Rikaz in Arabic. This department oversees all antiquities looting and trafficking inside ISIS territory through directing research and investigation of known sites, identification of new sites, excavations, and marketing. And we can confidently add stealing antiquities from local museums. Think of the area from Mosul all the way to Aleppo. There are many local museums throughout this region, and they're all under control of ISIS. Furthermore, this department issues excavation license, such as the example on this slide, to regulate the looting of antiquities and create a steady stream of income through taxation, which is 20% of each transaction. These measures are strictly enforced using Sharia law penalties for anyone excavating or selling antiquities without proper licensing or paying taxes. But then, who are the buyers? who is buying these antiquities from ISIS? As you may expect, criminal gangs and professional traffickers are most of the time involved in buying antiquities directly from ISIS and its affiliated members. They then smuggle them to buyers in the Arab Gulf states, Asia, Europe, and the United States. Clearly, looted antiquities go through several transactions between different dealers, with each one buying and selling for higher price before they reach collectors through private and black market sales. Faced with this massive destruction of cultural heritage, several universities and institutions have been working to document and preserve what they could. Here in New York, at Columbia University, it appears that we were ahead of our time when in 2013, Professor Zainab Bahrani initiated the project Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments in the Department of Art History and Archaeology. This project provides digital records for Mesopotamian standing monuments and facilitates future conservation work. Our US-based team of archaeologists and art historians work closely with our Iraqi, Syrian, and Turkish colleagues to document monuments dating from ancient times to the early mid-20th century, including churches, monasteries, ancient monuments, mosques, synagogues, and others, houses. The project provides high-resolution stills, detailed images, and panoramas. These images and panos are then uploaded to our database, as you see in this example. I have to mention here that Mapping Mesopotamia is the only project that is documenting Christian and later heritage by actually being on the ground, while other projects focus on pre-Christian heritage of this region and usually work with satellite images. In 2013, we managed to document sites that are now very close to ISIS-controlled territories, and I will show you only a few examples here. I will start with this site. It is an Assyrian site. It's called Maldaye, and I will show you one of our documentation site. So this is its panorama photography of the site. The site is a rock relief, so there is this is what you're looking at is a rock relief, and it's oops, I did not mean to do that. Okay. Okay. So this is the rock relief. It's carved on the face of a cliff in a very high mountain. You can zoom in. Yes. So basically, with this type of photography, you can zoom in and you can see what the relief shows. And the representation here is of an Assyrian king that is standing here, facing gods and goddesses who are standing on their respective mythical animals. And at the end of the relief, there is another king. However, the whole site consists of 4 of these rock reliefs. So that is the first relief that you're looking at. This is the second and the best preserved. This is the third with the hole in it. This hole was dug by treasure hunters, thinking that there is gold behind this relief. So they dug the hole and went in. And obviously there was no gold, but they damaged the relief. And the 4th relief is where that person is standing. I want to ask you to keep this relief with the hole in it in mind, because we'll come back to it for 1 second. Now, with this way of documenting, you get a sense cultural landscape. That's what gives you. This site was safe until this morning when we received news that this site has been vandalized, and apparently it was shot at using machine gun, and also a graffiti and the Kurdish flag was painted on one of these reliefs, as you can see this, and this was this morning. I received this image. Other sites that we documented is the monastery of 7th century. This is about like 12 kilometers away from ISIS now. So far the site is safe. The main temple of the Yazidi people in Iraq, we documented that. So far it is safe too. And then this is a relief site, a cave with the relief. It's in a remote area, but it's safe so far. In 2015, we expanded the project to include Southeast Turkey, given the political tension that was rising by then, and we were right, because now there is a conflict. So we were able to document this Assyrian rock relief that is right on the Tigris in Southeast Turkey. Also, we documented the great mosque of the city of Diyarbakir, which is in Southeast Turkey too, and this is safe so far. However, we know that bombing has they've bombed historical churches in Diyarbakir, basically Armenian churches. In conjunction with our project at Columbia and in collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we organized a 2-day intensive workshop in Istanbul. The workshop was set to mainly invite colleagues from Iraq, Syria, and Turkey to hear their voices and learn about their needs on the ground. By the end of the workshop, it was clear to us that there is an urgent need for documentation and conservation projects. Other outcomes from this workshop have inspired several other projects, small projects, such as translation of educational book on ancient Near East from English to Arabic, providing photography kits and training of Iraqi and Syrian graduate and postgraduates here in New York, which we are working on with the Metropolitan Museum. Now, such academic efforts are crucial to help save the cultural heritage of Iraq and Syria as a significant part of our global cultural heritage. However, much more support is needed for these projects to continue. For these efforts to succeed and have impact on the ground, international laws related to antiquities, illicit trade, and conventions on the protection of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage at event of armed conflict must be enforced by all political parties involved in the current conflict in Syria and Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Barbara Hoffman, my fellow Brunonian and graduate of Columbia Law School with an MA from Johns Hopkins School of International Studies and a second MA from the London School of Economics, is the principal of the Hoffman Law Firm and a preeminent arts, cultural heritage, and cultural institution lawyer in New York City, providing transactional advice and litigation services to the domestic and international arts and cultural community. For more than 30 years in the field of art law, has given her wide expertise on matters involving art, antiques, and cultural property transactions. Barbara, a pioneer in the field of public art, not only developed for the city bar the model contract for the field, but also litigates and counsels in the IP and related areas, such as authors' rights, publishing, film, TV, and entertainment, internet, and news media, new media. A frequent speaker at conferences and CLE programs, Barbara's recent engagements have been in New Delhi, Rome, San Francisco, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and the Foreign Ministry in Asuncion. Barbara is a former chair of both our Committee on Art Law and the International Bar Association Committee on Art, Cultural Institutions, and Heritage Law. She has served as outside counsel for the College Art Association, as a former board member of Art Table, New York Women in Film and Television, the Williams Art Conservation Institute, the Explorers Club, where she was also chair of the legal committee, and the International Association of Art Critics. She Currently serves on boards of Performa, the Anyone Can Fly Foundation, Currents Art Music, and the Salvador Dali Foundation, and is here to tell us what we need to know about the U.S. and international law that applies to stolen art and antiquities. Thank you, Barbara.
I'm going to sit here if it's okay, and I feel really last century because I don't have a PowerPoint. I prepared for people, but I think not enough, a reader and source book. And that, for people who haven't received it, I have left also a table of contents, and if you're interested in the material and you contact me, I'm happy to send you an email version. The reason I spent so much time putting together this source book is that I think it's really important that people be aware of not all of the current international treaties, but my talk is going to be proactive in the sense that I hope to leave you with recommendations and an awareness of what hopefully needs to be done to deal with a very difficult legal situation. And in making this presentation, I was really struck by the remarks of the ambassador, because many of the things that he said and the quandary that he posed really exists when you look at the evolving legal landscape, both internationally and in the United States, with how to deal with the illicit plunder of, well, the plunder of heritage sites and archaeological sites, and the illicit trade in what is now called conflict antiquities. I'm going to start out with some very general principles because I don't know what everybody understands about international law. International law is a universal body of law that applies to all states, regardless of their specific cultures, belief systems, and political organizations. There are two sources, essentially, of international law: treaty and custom. Where there is no treaty and no executive or legislative act or judicial decision, there is a resort to custom and what is called the usage of civilized nations. I'm going to focus particularly on the international legal regime for the protection of cultural property. Definitions of cultural property in international conventions determine not only what is protected, but also set forth the legal and ethical principles for state parties, which are also applicable to regional and international bodies, and by extrapolation, stakeholders, museums, collectors, auction houses, archaeologists, and others involved. And this becomes particularly relevant in times of conflict or where culture is at risk. Now, in my presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about the international legal conventions for protecting cultural heritage and the trade in illicit antiquities. And I'm going to focus specifically on those treaties and conventions which I think are most applicable to doing something about the problem with ISIS. In my table of contents and handout, I've listed all of the treaties, but treaties such as the World Heritage Treaty that was adopted in 1972 and which forms the basis for the designation of these World Heritage Sites, while it is very important, is not really a tool, as we can see, given the fact that it requires control of the state party of the territory which is involved. And so the treaties that I'm talking about and the way in which I'm looking at them are really looking at these in a way that we're dealing with what can be done by states who have the power to do it, and that includes focusing on the end game or prohibiting the importation of illicit antiquities and looking towards the networks that and conviction of people that are involved in this network. I'm then going to look at specific international and regional legislation which is related to Middle East antiquities, trade, and ISIL. And obviously I can't talk in detail about any of these statutes, but I'm going to focus specifically on the most important UN resolutions and regional declarations that I think are relevant. Similarly, I will then look at US legislation related to these issues and particularly focus on current legislation which is being considered by the US Senate, which I believe really needs to be passed. And I am also going to focus on other things that can be done in the US to update and reinforce our commitment to dealing with the problem of what we can call conflict of antiquities. I probably won't have time, and I'll take questions on it, to look at future international platforms and models, dealers' codes of ethics, and the fact that I'm not talking about them is not that I don't think they're important, it's just that I don't have time. So, with that said, I want to move to the international legal framework, and I think it's important to start with the Hague Convention. International law protects cultural heritage from destruction and plunder during armed conflict. The most important treaty in this area is the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. This imposes obligations to safeguard the cultural heritage during international cross-border conflicts, but also, and importantly for our discussion, during internal conflicts. The Hague Convention was adopted in the aftermath of World War II when so much destruction occurred, and it was adopted to prevent a repeat of the destruction of important monuments and sites. The convention requires that countries undertake to prohibit, prevent, and stop theft, pillage, or misappropriation of cultural property, and imposes obligations on occupying powers to prevent exploitation of cultural property, to take into custody cultural property exported, and to return it. Now, the second protocol of the Hague Convention is even more important. It was adopted after the Iraq War, and it looked at some of the weaknesses in the Hague Convention itself. And significantly, and I think going forward, looking at this, the second protocol, while it provides for many things, one of the things that it does is to provide enforcement mechanisms for defining serious violations leading to criminal sanctions and imposing a duty on member states to establish jurisdiction over those violations of the Hague Convention. It also, as I indicated, applies to non-international armed conflict. Importantly, Chapter 4 of the second protocol embodies the principle of individual criminal responsibility for acts of destruction of cultural heritage. Although the United States signed but did not ratify the Hague Convention until 2009, and has yet, unfortunately, to ratify the second protocol, which is another one of my recommendations. In Operation Desert Storm, the coalition forces adhered to the principles as tenets of customary international law. And the Hague Convention was viewed by many as dealing with what's called the international, the international view of cultural property, which is basically that we protect and preserve cultural property because of its significance for all humankind. The second important convention arose out of very different circumstances. It arose out of the widespread plundering in Africa and Latin America of cultural heritage, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, and the terrible impact that this looting was having on archaeological sites. It led UNESCO in 1970 to adopt what's called the UNESCO Convention, and its title describes what it's meant to do. It's the means of prohibiting the illegal export and import of cultural property. What's important to realize for those of you who don't operate in this area is that under international law, one nation doesn't enforce the criminal laws of another country in its own country. Similarly, in the United States and other countries, another nation doesn't enforce the export laws of another country absent some treaty or other convention. And so once you know this principle, you see how important the UNESCO 1970 Convention was. It became the linchpin of an international legal framework for controlling traffic in illegal and cultural stolen property. It represents another view of cultural property, and that was that cultural objects have special significance for specific groups and thus support the efforts of such groups to regulate their trade and seek their repatriation. The UNESCO Convention is a convention that works on a government-to-government level, and therefore it's the United States government, Homeland Security, the diplomatic service that's making a demand to return the objects stolen from Egypt, etc. Notwithstanding that the UNESCO Convention has been successful in tamping down on the illicit trade of antiquities among legitimate state actors, as well as influencing museums and other collecting institutions to check provenance and use due diligence. If you remember, 1970 was a period of, in the United States, don't ask, if it's beautiful, take it. That attitude has changed tremendously in the United States, and there has been a sea change in how we consider cultural property and whether it should be returned. While that change is important, UNESCO does little, the 1970 Convention, to reach the kind of underground trading, including web-based trading, I understand, that ISIS is performing with private collections. What's the companion to the UNESCO treaty is the Unidroit Treaty, which I won't talk about now, but it deals with the private law aspects that weren't adequately dealt with in the UNESCO Convention. These two treaties embody legal and ethical principles, and it's important to understand these principles because going forward, new ethical and legal principles are developing which form the basis for dealing with ISIS and legislation and concerted actions going forward. So what we have derived from these treaties thus far is the principle of cooperation and collaboration against illegal movements of cultural property. The principle of the preservation of the integrity of cultural contexts. 3, the principle of cooperation in settling disputes on the return of cultural property and the preservation of cultural heritage. And lastly, and this I think relates to going forward as well, The principle of non-exploitation of the weakness of another to get cultural gain. And all of those principles can be derived from the treaties. Now, two other conventions bear notice. The first is the Convention for the Safeguarding of the International Cultural Heritage. And as was mentioned, I think you mentioned, Mr. Freeman, that one has to think of pluralism. And the idea of pluralism, many different ways that expression of the people deserve protection, is embodied in this, I'll be quicker, is embodied in this particular treaty. But it also says that it has to be consistent with human rights. Since I have to move on, I really want to touch on what's happening now. Since ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the adoption of cultural cleansing, these principles have been supplanted with additional cultural heritage principles. The equation of what has been going on, for example, the destruction of cultural heritage in Mali, Syria, and Iraq, are now linked directly to terrorism and its finances, political instability, global security, and war crimes. The International Criminal Court has now taken its first case dealing with Mali, and under the terms of the Rome statutes, war crimes include basically attacks on religious, cultural, and cultural institutions. It's the first time that the International Criminal Court has taken a cultural heritage case as a war crime. And I'm just going to really refer very quickly, 3 minutes?
We're supposed to be over in a minute, but...
Okay, 3 minutes. And you can get this in the materials, but the United Nations Security Council has issued a resolution under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter condemning any trade with the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. The resolution targets of interest to us here antiquities. Second, the Senate, the countries met in Cairo, the Middle Eastern countries that we're talking about met in Cairo in May to form a regional union to deal with the illicit trade in antiquities. Third, our own implementation of UNESCO, the Cultural Property Implementation Act, only implemented Article 7b and Article 9 of the Convention. That provides for bilateral treaties under one of its arms, and to date we have bilateral treaties with 15 nations and one imposed emergency action with terms for Iraq. We need to enter into more bilateral treaties, but in order for that to happen and the conditions that are required to enter into them, changes have to be made, and the president has to be able to issue executive orders finding an emergency to do that. And finally, as I said, the Senate now is considering a bill 1887, which is included in my packet. That the House has passed a bill called the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act. It has been held up in the Senate since July, and it's recently passed the Foreign Relations Committee. That will apply specifically to antiquities coming in from Syria and will enable customs to seize them at the border and put them on the equivalent with the Iraq situation. And so finally, I just want to end by saying that just as there was a sea change in 1970 with the way the United States didn't adopt the CPIA until 1983 because of a conflict between the art dealers and the archaeologists, the auction houses. And just as there has been a sea change now in the idea of giving back cultural property, and the debate seemed to have been resolved, there's now another debate because the focus on repatriation and giving back doesn't really seem appropriate in many ways to the ISIS situation where there's so much destruction. So the real question is, and this goes back to the ambassador's statement, how are we fighting this? Who are we fighting? Are we fighting terrorism? Are we fighting organized crime? And do we have to rethink our notions of a strategy for cultural heritage policy?
The original plan was for a Q&A session. The original plan was also that we'd be done at 9 o'clock. We violated one of those already. I guess until they throw us out, we can try to entertain a few questions. First, before we lose the audience, I'd like to ask you all to join me in. Okay, sir.
Yes, a fabulous presentation. When I was in Afghanistan about 10 years ago, we were working with 3 different bodies of law, which were pretty related. There was Sharia, civil law, and tribal law. Now, civil law, by its term, is subject to Sharia the way American statutory law is subject to the Constitution. So there's no tension there. The tribal law was sort of a maverick body of law. It was vaguely Islamic, but not really subject to any of the rules. And from what your panel is admirably presented tonight, it's clear to me that ISIS uses Islam as some sort of excuse, the way communism uses Karl Marx or Hitler used mythology. And I was wondering whether the ISIS chose to, they could use a different body of law, like tribal law or some other cockamamie body of law as a substitute for Islam.
I don't think terrorists and bad people have had a problem over the last 7,000 or 8,000 years to find justification. I think you're right. Well, the question, and I know none of us really have any particular insight, hopefully, is how sincere ISIS is. I think what you've heard, especially from Professor Freeman, is that they have legitimate sources in Islamic law for what they're saying, whether they believe them or they use them as an excuse. I think there's the line from Man of La Mancha, when the pitcher hits the stone or the stone hits the pitcher, it's still going to be bad for the pitcher.
I don't think ISIS has a deep reading of Islamic law. First of all, its treatment of Christians in the Islamic tradition. Well, first thing you go to St. Catherine's of Sinai, you see is the treaty that Omar sent. No monastery should be attacked according to the Islamic law. This is an absolute fantasy. They're making it up as they go along. I think as in many cases, Catholic historians speak about the difference between tradition and traditionalism. Tradition is represented by something like the Sheikh of the Azhar or Sistani in Iraq. But traditionalism, which is a kind of fantasy reconstruction of the past, is what these people are engaged in. And they're not, beyond which, Sharia was never a written code in the pre-modern period. The Ottomans were the first people to try and write it and make it a territorial law. It was never a territorial law. It was always according to the judgment of the judge or jurisconsult. This is a completely different modern situation, both in terms of their use, the derivation of the law, and in terms of application of the law. I mean, so you know, a tribal law was used by Saddam Hussein to try and combat. So it has an extremely bad connotation in the Iraqi context. And nobody said, it's quite true that Muslim reformers have said customary law must have an increased role. But that doesn't constitute a total reformation of the Sharia. The trouble we have had reformulations of the Sharia, but national codes are kind of mixed versions of Sharia and all kinds of things, as Bob said in his introduction.
I think I agree. I would be a little more cautious. On the question of slavery, the way that ISIS has been carrying out that policy is not consistent with Sharia. There was no war with the Yazidi people, or no any kind of justification for the way that those women have been treated. And similar things will now start to happen, I think, in Libya. But on the other hand, they use the ostensible sort of recitation of the law as a propaganda tool. So in the Daily Mail, the UK Daily Mail, just recently, ISIS issued a 15-point set of regulations in terms of relationships with slaves that is verbatim from the Islamic rules. But the context in which they are applying that is just really to encourage men to take and hold concubines under what are otherwise illegal circumstances. So it's a almost schizophrenic use of the Islamic law. The law that they promulgate is in fact the law, but the context in which they do it is not Islamic.
My question relates to Islamic law. Should we refer to Islamic law or ISIS law? I see very much stress on Islamic law and about slavery, but that's what ISIS is doing. If we talk about Egypt, for example, in 1870, as the ambassador mentioned, they forbid slavery, and that was at the same time almost like Europe and America, a few years later. So my question, why do you insist on putting Islamic law, not ISIS law, which is that state that's implementing these type of laws?
We actually did a program here a year and a half ago entitled ISIS, Islam, and the Asymmetric Law of International War, where we had people addressing the issue of whether ISIS should be considered a nation state, whether it has the ability to promulgate law, whether it was a legitimate polity, and you know, one of the conclusions of that is that it had more hallmarks of a nation state than some entities that are recognized by the United Nations of Nations, but it lacked the one essential attribute of a nation under modern international law, is that it wasn't recognized as a nation by any other country. So the simple answer to your question is, internationally, we don't recognize ISIS as being able to promulgate law. And that is, you know, if they were in fact a state, then you could be talking about the law of the Islamic State. You know, that from their point of view, they are cloaking themselves in their corrupted, if you want to call it schizophrenic, uneducated or whatever, law and as Professor Freeman noted, a very Salafist view of the fundamentalist formative period law of Islam that isn't the laws I mentioned anywhere. If they became a state, if they were to adopt these things as their law and they have legitimacy, then we could be talking about ISIS law, but as I said, as lawyers, there is no such thing. I think we're way beyond time. Is there any question? Yes, sir?
That's a little question, but I guess the whole thing, when we talk about ISIS, and ISIS is there, tomorrow could be another faction. So basically, there is a gang, it's not religion, it's really, they evolve. And my question is, do we bear a responsibility, and I'm talking globally, of why they exist? Is there some...
That's a political thing, and there are plenty of people with views on that. And but certainly not at this hour going to start opening that can of worms. Are there any questions related to anything anyone said here tonight? Yes, sir.
Just to have a comment on the presentation by Professor Frill regarding slavery. Of course, when we approach tourism...
Speak up.
Yes. When we address the issue of the message of coming from ISIS to win the hearts and minds of future recruits, we look into all aspects of this message.
They're actually focusing a little lower than hearts and minds, I think, with the slavery issue.
Slavery, of course, slavery is one of the points, but I think you are giving it a higher weight compared to other elements, including the issue of governance and communities, particularly as it doesn't explain why foreign fighters, terrorist fighters are joining ISIS.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be applicable to people who are recruited from some of the countries in Africa and the Middle East, but it doesn't explain for those who are coming from more open societies. So I think, and the fact that they are using some of the interpretation, first interpretation of Islam, doesn't reflect that there is an acceptance in the Islamic societies to the issue of slavery.
And Professor Frick wasn't saying that because they are doing it, it's okay. I think he was saying the exact opposite. That what they're doing is a corruption of something that been rejected in Islam for hundreds of years.
I think the professor said that the Islamic societies, Muslim societies now have a challenge to address the issue of slavery.
That's correct.
Yes. I think that this issue doesn't get any acceptance in the Muslim societies. So the focus should be on issues of governance and which ISIS and other terrorist groups are using to attract recruits from, as we mentioned, a number of countries from the Sahel region. And of course, in these areas where you have the highest level of poverty, when you have people earning less than $2 a day, when they are offered $2 a day, so that makes ISIS appealing to use population in these countries. But slavery, I think, it doesn't constitute that important factor in appealing to terrorist fighters, either from Middle East and Africa or from foreign countries.
Okay, well, that's something else we can't resolve tonight. Is there someone, one last question? Yes, Malvina?
Is ISIS the only entity that has slavery and justifies it under Islamic law?
Well, you already referred to Boko Haram.
No, I was under the impression, maybe wrongly, that Saudi Arabia and some other accepted states in the Middle East do permit slavery. I may be wrong.
No, that's not true. That's not true. At least from a state law position, all of the Middle Eastern nations, all of the Muslim nations that are recognized as nation states under our sort of Westphalian approach to states have signed conventions and agreed that slavery was to be abolished. The last one to do that was Mauritania in 1980. So there is no juridical support for slavery in any state, in any Muslim community now, except that ISIS is reviving it, but it's not recognized as a state by anyone else.
The countries that have signed treaties.
Have what?
Have they abolished it? Because I know, I remember Amnesty International did a study some years ago, of all states that ratified treaties against torture, only 35 states in the world did not use torture officially. So maybe they've abolished it juridically. Have they also abolished it factually?
I would say the answer factually, it depends on how you define slavery. If you define it broadly, the answer is no. If you're talking about chattel slavery, where I could go to a market and buy someone in a market, the answer is yes, that's abolished. Or in the case of Saudi Arabia, the way Saudi Arabia did it, the king purchased all the slaves and then freed them, and then by edict prohibited anyone from purchasing any other slaves, because the theory was that it was impossible for him to abolish it under the Sharia. But it was eliminated. It was eliminated, and slavery has been eliminated in all of the recognized nation states of the world in the Muslim world.
Okay, on that cheery note, let's end on a positive statement.